Hi, welcome to I Was Just Thinking. I'm Rudy Maxa, your genial host. Now, and normally I start this show by having a glass of wine, and I talk a little about the region that the wine comes from. But that's our engineer rustling papers around there. Tommy, can you give him the papers there? Tommy, you're rustling papers and stuff, books and stuff. Okay. But my guest today is I think worthy of all the time I can spend with him. I was going to do a Cannonau wine from Sardinia, down in southern Italy, but I will save that for 2 weeks from now. I have a particular fondness for wine from that part of the world, and I'll tell you why in 2 weeks. But instead, I'm having a glass of the last person to spend an overnight in my house was my friend Daisuke Utagawa, who's a Japanese chef in Washington, and he left me this, which is jasmine green tea unsweetened. Fortunately, it says that in English, not just in Japanese. So that's what so this is not white wine or that I'm drinking. Let me tell you about today's guest, who is still trying to figure out how to sign in, but that's okay because his bio is so long that, and he knows it, but there are very few authors who I think have the chutzpah or expertise to sit down and write a book and call it what my next guest called his, which is just land. But if there's anyone who could tackle such a large subject and make it fascinating, it's Simon Winchester, the author I have on. His newest book is called Land, and in all fairness, there is a subtitle, How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. And since this is a travel-oriented webcast, maps and contours of countries should be of interest. But first, let me tell you a little about Simon. It's a very impressive biography, and I'm going to spend more time telling you about Simon than I've told you about any guests I've ever had. He began his adult life after growing up in England, and reading geology at St. Catherine's College, which is a constituent college of the University of Oxford. And while a student at the St. Catherine's College, which the Brits call CATS, he was a member of the University Exploration Club. And in that capacity, he was part of a 6-man sledding expedition into an uncharted section of the East Greenland ice camp in 1965. And that was the beginning of Simon Winchester's life as an explorer. He later joined a Canadian mining company after he graduated from university. He worked as a field geologist in Uganda looking for copper deposits near the border of Congo. While in Uganda, he read a book by one of the world's best-known travel writers, who just passed away last November, by the way, named John Morris. The book was called Coronation Everest, and it was an account of Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's successful summit of Mount Everest in 1953. Morris was the only journalist on the expedition. And though it should be noted that book was written under the name Jan Morris, and you're welcome to learn how Jan Morris became John Morris in his own book called Conundrum that was published in 1974. At any rate, that book by Mr. Morris at the time spoke to Simon Winchester in a big way. He got interested in journalism. So he started writing newspaper editors looking for a job, even as he was working on an offshore oil rig in the North Sea. And he finally got a job at the Journal in Newcastle on Tyne. Then he moved to the big time, to London, to work for The Guardian in 1969. It took him only 2 years in London to be named Britain's Journalist of the Year in 1971. From Calcutta, he went to cover the war, or he went there and covered the war that led to Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan. In 1972, he was sent to D.C. to cover Richard Nixon, Watergate. And there he also wrote a book called In Holy Terror about his years of reporting during the Troubles in Ireland. So you might be beginning to get an idea that this guy, Simon Winchester, gets around. From D.C., he was posted to New Delhi. He drove his family's Volvo from Oxford to India, by the way. From there, he went to London and by chance happened to be in the Falklands when Argentine forces tried to claim that island for Argentina. He was captured in Patagonia and he was held for 3 months in a prison way down south there in Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. His next post was Hong Kong for The Guardian. And when Condé Nast Traveler magazine began, he was recruited to be their Asian editor. Okay. That only gets us to 1997, after which time Simon decided to become a best-selling author. His breakthrough book was called The Professor the Madman. It's a great read. It's a terrific account of an unknown American who became instrumental in the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary, the so-called OED, which is sort of the Bible for the English language. I am not going to spoil the surprise about the unknown American who so contributed to that. You got to read the book. Then there was his book about the history of the Yangtze River in China. His book on the first authentic geological map of England, drawn by a farmer, a map that the august British Geological Society tried to usurp because they had no idea of what they should have had an idea of. Then he wrote a book on the global impact of the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. He wrote a book on the Pacific, the Atlantic, and a whole lot more, including 2 books for young adults, one on earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, another on the worst weather in the world, which covered tornadoes and hurricanes and more. Keep in mind, he was trained as a geologist, so he's got a great interest in land, borders, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, all that kind of stuff. And just to put a cherry atop this journalistic cake, Simon was awarded the OBO, the Officer of the British Empire, for services to journalism and literature in 2006 in England. He lives with his wife in Massachusetts in the Berkshires today, which is where we reach him. I hope. I'm about to find out. Are you there, Simon? Simon is there. Can we bring Simon in? Oh,
well, hello. How are you, Rudy?
He's looking for a porthole there. Let's see if we can get him live. Simon, there's up to the left in your left-hand corner. There's something that looks like a locomotive in a blue circle coming right at you.
I can see him. Yes.
Must be a camera. There you are.
Yes, there I am.
Hi, Simon. Welcome back to the big show.
Well, thank you so much.
I don't know how much of you, that's the longest introduction I've ever given anybody probably in my life. I don't know how much of that you heard.
I sort of got in somewhere when you were talking about Jan Morris, and James Morris is his name, actually. It's not John, but James.
James. I'm sorry. I put John. I'm sorry. Well, let's start with this book. Let's start with the big picture. You write, and here I'm going to quote you, "The formal fault lines of the world have their origins in the informal decisions taken by a pair of prehistoric seedsmen in Wiltshire and by other plow farmers in the Yellow River Valley, in Mesopotamia, in the pueblos of New Mexico, in the mudflats of Bengal, and then the paddies of central Japan." Now, I know you're speaking generally, but what do you mean by all those places and the formal fault lines of the world being formed by these folks in disparate places?
Well, how does a border get created in the first place? Let's think about Wiltshire in southern England. And much the same thing occurred at about the same time all over the world, it seems to me, from the reading I've done. So you're in the Bronze Age, so this is now 10,000 years ago, and agriculture has begun. And this miraculous discovery made, and let's concentrate on England for the moment, that if you dig a hole in the earth with a stick, fire-hardened stick, maybe now it's the Bronze Age with a bit of metal on the end that makes it even stronger, you can dig a hole in the earth, and plant some seeds and water it, or the rain will water it, and after a few days, weeks, months, something will grow that you can eat. Well, this is an extraordinary discovery, I suppose, not to us, but to people 10,000 years ago. So then if you make a lot of holes in a line, you can do the same thing and plant a row of these plants. And then you've got enough leaves or fruit or whatever it is you happen to be fortunate enough to grow, and you can either eat it yourself or your wife and children, or give it, sell it to other people. So you've now got a sort of a business and a livelihood. So let's say you then decide to have lots of furrows, but all going in the same direction. It makes sense if all your furrows are, let's say, going in a north-south direction. So that's what you've made, a field or an area with a lot of lines all going north-south. Well, let's say there's a brother farmer, a colleague farmer, someone you know, might be a relative, might be a rival, might be someone you don't know, who's maybe 100 yards off to your west, on perhaps not the flat land that you've got. Maybe he's on the side of a hill, and he's also using these sticks. They're called cashroms, the earliest of these kinds of very primitive plows, digging his holes, but not digging them north-south, digging them because he's on the side of a hill in a sort of northwest-southeast direction. Well, at some point, these two sets of furrows, the ones going north-south and the ones going east-west, will meet. And they'll, as it were, in physics, they would interfere with one another. Like the ripples, if you throw two stones into a pond, the ripples will intersect, will interfere with one another. So
and you have a border.
Then you have a border, that's the point. And so they would put sticks or stones or maybe dig a trench, and lo and behold, there is a border. This land is my land, that land is your land. So just for the sake of efficiency, keep off. I mean, you may be growing a different crop from me. So thus began, there's no concept of ownership, but there is a sort of concept of superintendence, if you like. I'm superintending this piece of land, you're superintending that. And that border in a village between two farmers can then be extended over the years to surround the village. So that would be the parish boundary. And a county, an administrative region, you get county, and then you get national borders. So, and then you get frontiers, often sort of major world divisions that are marked by mountain ranges or great physical things like great rivers, the Yangtze, the Nile, or whatever. But they all began humankind's decisions to remain here and another one to remain there is because of the existence of a border drawn initially in a field in Wiltshire, but another field in Mesopotamia, and at Paddy in Japan, and so on.
But you say the majority of borders that we know today were created in the 19th and 20th centuries when there was, and I quote your glorious writing again, a fierce acceleration of nation building in 1850, territorial mayhem between 1875 and 1899 due to European adventurism and imperialism, and it reached its climacteric. That's a new word to me. How do you pronounce it?
Climacteric. It's like the sort of orgasm, if you like.
It's a climax. Yeah. Climacteric. Say it again.
Climacteric.
Climacteric. That's the word of the day. It reached climacteric in the first decades of the 20th century. So what 1850, 1879, what was going on there? Are we partly to blame the British Empire?
Oh, I'm afraid totally to blame the British, but not just the British. If you've read about the Congo, I mean, the Belgians behaved even worse than the British did. They were the French, the Spaniards, but I mean, think of Africa. Think of the scramble for Africa, as it's called. Well, that created new countries, new borders. Classic example, if you remember both of us have spent time in Hong Kong, Lugard Road, one of the famous roads in Hong Kong, named after Sir Henry, I think it was Henry Lugard, great colonial administrator. He created Nigeria. I mean, before Sir Henry Lugard, there were a bunch of this tribe, the Ashanti in the south and the Igbo in the northwest, and all manner of different races and religions and tribes. And he said, no, I'm going to administer this for Queen Victoria. And we're going to, because it's around the Niger River, we're going to call it Nigeria, and I'm going to draw a border. So borders were drawn largely from about 1850 to, let's say, 1920, as a consequence of European adventurism. And if I can give you a classic example of the extension of this behavior into modern times, I mean, as you very kindly mentioned, drove my car from Oxford to Delhi in 1972. And when I did so, because I had a rather grumpy passenger who wanted to do a bit of tourism, and I didn't want to do much tourism.
That was your wife?
It was not the wife. No. It was a man called Albert Meisel, now dead, who was the Deputy Archivist of the United States. Oh. And he had rung me from Washington and said, Simon, I hear you're leaving for driving to Delhi. And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, this was a Monday and I was leaving on the Friday. Could you give me a lift to Tehran? And I said, well, I could if you can get a visa and be here by noon outside the Guardian offices on Friday.
Can you give me a lift to Tehran?
That's great, the deathless line, isn't it? And I did, but we zoomed past I remember that vividly, that day, Friday, got into the car, he got there just in the nick of time, piled his bags onto the roof rack, my son and I, and now Albert, zooming down the M2 towards Dover, and there was Canterbury Cathedral on the left-hand side. And he said, oh, yeah, so that's Canterbury Cathedral. I'm not going to put on an American accent, but are we going to stop? And I said, no, Albert, I have to get to the Khyber Pass before the monsoon. And he said, well, this is ridiculous. We must stop. And I said, we're not going to. Same thing happened with Cologne Cathedral the next day. Zooming by, and by the time we got to Austria, he was so bad-tempered. I said, all right, we've made good enough progress that I'm not going to go down that beastly road, Vienna, Budapest, Bucharest, which is just full of trucks. So I'll turn right, go through Kitzbühel, have a decent large dinner with lots of cream cakes and things, and then cross the border into Yugoslavia, as it was then. And we zoomed through Yugoslavia, down the Dalmatian coast, and then turned left and went down to Skopje, and down to Alexandropolis, and then to Istanbul and on to the east. But when I went back, oddly enough, I mean, I won't bore you with the story, but basically Albert and my son and I had a picnic in a water meadow near Skopje. 1999, I came back to that part of the world with a British Army general's helicopter to look at the massacring that was going on of Kosovars by Serbs. And our helicopter, by extraordinary coincidence, landed in that same water meadow where we had the picnic. But the crucial thing was the reason why there were all sorts of refugee movements and things is that Yugoslavia had been cut up. It had been Balkanized into Serbia, into Bosnia-Herzegovina, into all these various small countries,
right.
All with warring peoples, all with borders created in the 1990s.
So borders do not always lead to peace, and I want to talk about India and Pakistan later. But the land surface of the Earth is about 37 billion acres. You say,
yeah.
Measuring it has long, according to your book, been a quest for folks who lived centuries ago. Tell us about this guy, Eratosthenes.
Eratosthenes, yes. I'm sorry. There are a lot of tongue twisters in this book, and I do apologize.
Eratosthenes, who 2,000 years ago, he came close to accurately measuring the circumference of the Earth. How did he do that 2,000 years ago?
He was jolly good, a very clever man, Eratosthenes, a geographer and mathematician, and he realized that the Earth was curved, and he realized, therefore, because he could see the horizon of the Mediterranean, and if he measured the angle of the sun at noon falling down a well in Alexandria in northern Egypt and compared at noon the sun in a well 700 miles south in Upper Egypt in Aswan, there would be a difference in angle from which he could compute that using principles of triangles and so forth, which you may remember from school geometry, the size of the arc between Alexandria and Aswan. And he did compute it and said it must be about, well, he used cubits, of course, but in contemporary measurement, it was about 700 kilometers. So then that's a fraction of the planet. Measure it, sort of extrapolate, and you can work out that the Earth that he did was 39,000 kilometers in circumference. The Earth happens to be a little over 40,000. But that's for incredible. A man 2 millennia ago, that's pretty darn good, is it not?
That is incredible. I mean, I just find that amazing. Of course, I can't add two to two plus two, but and then there was this guy you say who's very underappreciated today. I liked his Herr Struve,
yeah,
who spent 40 years creating something called, that I've never heard of, but apparently insiders and geologists like you know, is the Struve geodetic arc. What is that?
He was an astronomer. He grew up in Estonia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. Many Russians would like it to be part of the empire again, hence NATO.
Yes, they would.
So I think it was the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, who was a keen astronomer, said, we've got to know how big the Earth is exactly. And the way to do that, just as Eratosthenes decided 2,000 years before, is to measure a meridian, one of those long lines that comes down from the pole. And so he charged Herr von Struve, Friedrich von Struve, who was among many things a very fertile man. He produced 19 children by a variety of spouses, but he was energetic in all other means as well. And they don't put me off. He said, yes, I'm going to measure.
Can I just interrupt you? This is one reason your books are so fascinating. Because you don't just say, well, there's this really smart guy and he wanted to, measure the meridians and he took out all this equipment and so on. I mean, only you put in your book that he was quite energetic, 19 children, etc. I mean, that's your eye for the anecdote is why your books are bestsellers.
I want to
compliment you.
Very keen on taking out his equipment. And he, in this case, the equipment I'm talking about is made of brass and glass and measuring things. These were theodolites. And to measure a meridian stretching for about, getting on for 2,000 miles, from Hammerfest in northern Norway down to Odessa on the Black Sea. And he did this, much as Eratosthenes had done, by the principle of triangles. You measure the base of a triangle, you put a theodolite up somewhere north of it, and measure or sight with the telescope on a theodolite 2 points at either end of the line you've measured, calculate the angles by using the theodolite's vernier scales. And then if you know the angles and you know the length of one of the lines of the triangles, you can work out one of the others. And one of the others will be the line of the meridian you're trying to measure. Well,
when we see guys when we see road engineers out there looking through what looks like a telescope to us, it's got a tripod and is that what you're doing?
That's a laser theodolite. I mean, infinitely more accurate. I mean, poor old.
That's basically.
It's exactly. Not only are they measuring the angle, but also the height. And that's, you see a man with a pole or some sort of a marker. And if the laser goes horizontally, then but it may be he's up on a hill and you'll know the road has to go up a certain number of degrees or down. Yes, it's exactly the same thing. Just, in my view, not nearly as romantic and interesting. A laser is a laser, but a theodolite is a piece of poetry. And if you go to the great Indian Survey Museum in Dehradun in northern India, the theodolites that were used for the great triangulation of India, which was conducted by a man, the pronunciation of his name may surprise you. He was the head of the Indian Survey, Sir George Everest, whose name was given to the tallest mountain in the world, which is mispronounced Everest. So your listeners may be intrigued when they go to the pub tonight to say, I bet you don't know how to pronounce the name of the tallest mountain in the world. It is technically Everest.
Okay, we can win a bar bet with that. Thank you, Simon.
Indeed. But anyway, that theodolite was a monster, and that had to be lugged all the way from the northern Himalayas right down to Cape Cormoran, the one at the very southern end tip of India, the triangular bit. And it weighed half a ton, and they had porters carrying this monster, and it made it. And the survey of India, when it was completed in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, was correct now to 3/4 of an inch.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. These Victorian surveyors, and von Struve was a classic of the kind, were amazing human beings. Anyway, von Struve, produced the result that the Earth was in circumference 40,000 and I think 38 kilometers, 300 and something meters and a few centimeters. And GPS today tells us he was effectively right.
Wow.
And now the interesting thing is that all the little X's carved into stones all the way from Hammerfest to Odessa still exist deep in the forests. And someone's discovered them and wrote to the United Nations, and they're now a UN heritage site. So you can go to Latvia, as I did, or northern Norway, or southern Georgia, or wherever, and find these things and know that you're a part of history.
These markers. Yeah, you mentioned your tromp through the woods to find that. Let's talk about boundaries, because as travelers, we're very aware of boundaries. Of course, there are a lot of boundaries that Americans aren't allowed to cross anymore, Brits for that matter as well. But it's sort of a cliche in the United States that our border with Canada is I don't know, the longest unguarded national border in the world. But you write about a tiny slice of it, about 123 square miles, on which live 123 people at the last census, by coincidence, that is guarded, at least electronically, by the United States, and I suppose Canada. It's a piece of Minnesota, but it's in Canada, and it's called the Northwest Angle. Yeah. How did this piece of Minnesota wind up in Canada?
An awful mistake was made in the late 1880s, 1890s, by people who thought that the Mississippi River rose in the Lake of the Woods, which is this great sort of amalgam of water to the northwest of Lake Superior. And it doesn't. But those who thought it did drew the boundary of the United States with this misguided assumption. And then there was an oops moment in the realization that the Mississippi actually begins at Lake Itasca, up in northern Minnesota, near where you are. And then they had the embarrassment of discovering that they had, as it were, left a bit of the United States marooned, as you rightly say, in Canada. And so you can get there by crossing the Lake of the Woods, by canoe or powerboat or whatever, or you can get there by land. But to do that, you have to drive up to Duluth and then turn left and find your way across to northwestern Minnesota, go north over the border to one of these very small, seldom crossed border posts, which I love going through.
So you're going into Canada.
You're going into Canada, but the guys are so bored, they just love seeing you. And no, at last, an immigrant. And so you cross into Manitoba and you drive through nothing for about 50 miles. And then there's a sign which says northwest angle. So you turn right, you go on a road through, once again, nothing. And then you come to a little hut with an American flag, and you're ordered to stop. There's no one there. You go in, and you're confronted by a big notice warning you in red what you must and must not do, and a television camera, a television set, and a telephone. And you pick that up, and the television set immediately comes to life, and there's a man there sitting in Washington, D.C., 24 hours a day, well, presumably a different man, and he says, show me your passport. You hold up your passport, and he reads it, or some electronic device reads it, and he'll say, I give you permission to enter the northwest angle of the United States. And you drive on, and there are cameras everywhere. So if you, by any chance, ignore that hut and the American flag and just think, oh, this is no, you will be found out. Helicopters will arrive, and nasty men from immigration and customs enforcement will throw you out. So unguarded this border may be, but it's electronics everywhere. And you go to Northwest Angle, it's a pretty dull place.
Who's
who's in it?
Who's in those helicopters? Americans or Canadians?
Oh, no, well, Canadians don't mind if you enter America illegally.
No, I guess so.
They're Americans.
Right. As if you could
you get nasty people.
Right.
As if you could do much harm. There's nothing. I mean, it might be killing a moose, but that's about as far as you could go.
Well, let's talk about one of the other most mangled efforts to create borders. It was made by an Englishman, and the results are still plaguing us today. Can you capsulize the saga of a Welsh lawyer named Sir Cyril Radcliffe? What was his?
Yes, and I think this is where we wipe the smile off our faces, because Northwest Angle may be amusing. This is not amusing. Summer of 1947. Britain has decided at long last to give independence to India. So they bring home Lord Wavell, who was the last one viceroy, and send in a relative of the royal family, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who arrives in Delhi to be the last British viceroy. And he says, well, we're going to accelerate this. We're going to give India its independence on the 15th of August, which is a matter of sort of 6 or 7 weeks' time, which is an incredible timetable. This is 600 million people are going to be given their independence. And the British are all going to leave. All the administrative apparatus and the military apparatus is all going to pull out and go back to England. So he would like, and Prime Minister to be Nehru and the Mahatma Gandhi, they would all like India to be given its independence as a united country. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, said, no, we've got to create a special homeland for the Muslims. And we're going to call it Pakistan, an acronym, Punjab, Afghan, Kashmir, India, Stan. But there've got to be two of them. There's got to be one in West Pakistan, west of Delhi. There's one on East Pakistan, in Bengal, east of Calcutta. And Mountbatten essentially throws up his hands and said, all right, well, if that's to be, we've got to get someone over to create a border of these new countries. And so he rings up this perfectly nice, very loyal, decent civil servant, a Welshman called Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who has never been to India, never been east of Paris, in fact, not a well-traveled man. And they tell him, okay, we're going to pay you some money and you've got to create a new country. You've got to create Pakistan. And so he flies over, somewhat unwillingly, partly excited, I should think. And he immediately gets ill with Delhi belly and goes up into the relative cool of the hills in the Himalayan foothills, town of Simla, where he's given a house and 6 assistants who turn out to all hate each other, and a series of out-of-date maps and some demographic figures showing the population and the breakdown of the Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs in the various towns. And he proceeds with a fountain pen to draw a line from the sea near Karachi all the way up to the Himalayas. And it takes him 6 weeks, and he hates doing it. And he realizes he's done a pretty shoddy job, but that's his orders. And he presents the maps to Mountbatten down in the Viceregal Palace in Delhi. And Mountbatten accepts them and says, right, Jinnah, that's your new country. And that's your new country in East.
Good luck.
Good luck. Declares independence and then says to the public, these are the new countries. Off you go to the races. And what happened then remains one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, because millions of Muslims, now trapped, as it were, in what was going to be a Hindu-run country, they said it was to be secular, but effectively Hindu-run, raced like mad to get into the security, as they saw it, of Pakistan. And the Hindus that were trapped in this new Pakistan equally raced eastwards to get into India. And caught in the middle were hundreds of thousands of Sikhs. And mayhem ensued. And there was killing on a titanic scale. And people to this day say it was more than 1 million people died in this slaughter. It was absolutely chaotic. And poor old Cyril Radcliffe, he was a broken man. He returned to England. This bloody line, he said, that he had created would haunt him for the rest of his days. He refused to accept the fee he had been offered. He burned all his notes, which made life very difficult for his would-be biographers, and he retired to the country, rueing the day that he ever set foot and ever tried to create a border. And today, as if you go onto YouTube, you can see one legacy of what he's left, because there's only one entryway into and out of this frontier between India and Pakistan.
And describe what happens every night at that entry, that one gateway between Pakistan and India.
Well, it's a place called Wagah. And when I drove the car, having dropped Albert in Istanbul, so my son and I passed through Wagah from Pakistan into India with great ease. That was 1976. But no longer. India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed countries, regard this border as almost as sensitive as the border between North and South Korea. It's 1,700 miles of arc lights and barbed wire and minefields and sentries, with this one entry point. And every night, as the sun goes down, there's a ceremony. On either side, there are bleachers. On one side, the bleachers are full of cheering Indians, and on the other side, full of cheering Pakistanis, who never, ever go across the border because they're not allowed to. Essentially, only foreigners can. And they're jeering at each other and shouting. And the Indian government sends the tallest imaginable soldiers, members of the Border Security Force, as it's called, to perform this extraordinary sort of ballet-like ritual. It looks like Monty Python Ministry of Silly Walks with high kicking. I couldn't possibly do it. But they're like the New York Rockettes. And on the Pakistan side, exactly the same thing with the dark uniformed members of the Pakistan Rangers. And they shout at each other and they march towards each other. And then at the finale, two of the tallest, heavily armed, with their moustaches quivering and their turbans shaking in the sunlight, they march towards each other until they're moustache to moustache, nose to nose, with the line, Cyril Radcliffe's line, under their feet, over which they would never dare tread. And with great ceremony, they reach across it and shake each other's hands, salute, slam the gates shut, and the border's closed for another night. Every night. Something which is filmed, and you can see YouTube. Go to Wagah border closing ceremony. You'll never forget it.
Unbelievable. All right. So the concept of borders, the concept of maps, obviously very fluid depending on political situations, even today. The invention of transcontinental aviation, or the advent of aviation, created a whole new kind of mapping required for pilots. And that required, yes, you had to know where the mountains were, didn't you?
You did, and I remember vividly an awful demonstration of that. If you remember the air traffic controllers strike during Reagan's administration, I had to go and interview some people in Montana, and I flew to the wrong airport. I thought they were in eastern Montana, and they turned out to be in western Montana. So there were no civil flights then flying because the strike or the lockout had happened. So I found there was an air taxi service, and so I paid a lot of money to get on a plane, a little Cessna, I think it was. So here am I sitting on the right-hand side or whatever it is, the pilot on the left, and I'm looking at his map as we drone across the plains of eastern Montana, which is flat as a pancake. And I looked at the map, which, as you rightly say, every map is divided into squares with the highest altitude in that square in bold letters on it, so pilots can be aware of an obstacle, as it were, high up. And in this particular square, across which we were flying, it was 14,500 feet, which were the Grand Teton Mountains to which we were heading. And I noticed the altimeter saying we were at 10,000 feet and heading straight for the mountains. And I looked to my left, and the pilot was fast asleep.
Oh, God.
So I'm thinking, what's the polite thing to do in this circumstance? And so I gave him a little cough, and he woke up, and I said, pointed to the map, and he said, oh, terribly sorry, not to worry, and up we went.
No. The usefulness of maps.
Thank God the maps existed, yes. He had forgotten, and he was so tired.
Now, there was some kind of massive mapping effort in the United States, and apparently it was never completed, but there's a whole stack of maps that were done that are now parked at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. What was that about, and why was it never completed?
It's an extraordinary story, but it was never completed because of the maps you've just been discussing. There was no need for the kind of sophisticated maps that people had dreamed up in the 1890s. This was the idea of a German called Albrecht Penck, who decided, once we knew the size of the world, and that we knew because of von Struve, we could create accurate, very accurate maps, which are essential if you're going to own some land. And so at the International Geographical Congress, which I think was held in Basel, I think, in about 1890, Penck stood up and said, gentlemen, I'd like to have an international project to map the entirety of the planet at the same scale, 1 to 1 million. We're going to call it the International Map of the World at 1 to 1 million. And these maps will all have the same colors, the same typeface, they'll all be in English, and they will be with such a projection that if you stuck them all together, you would never do that, of course, but if you did, they would make a globe of the world 1/1,000,000th the size of the world, so about the size of a house. And the geographers thought, yes, capital idea. And Penck said, but no nation can map itself, because that would make, people would do boastful things. Maps, a whole different subject, but maps lie. I mean, maps are propaganda, tools of propaganda. So in order to make sure that these maps are neutral, as if you like, the United States was set to work to map China, the Portuguese to map, South Africa, the British to map Brazil. I can't remember the precise details. But as a result of this, to map the entire world, it's about 900 sheets, a little bit shy, about 885 sheets. And by the time the First World War began, people had produced about 100 of them. Then there was the war, and then it cranked up again. And by the beginning of the Second World War, they'd made about 400. And then, 1947, the mapping started again. And by the 1980s, they had produced about 820. But the steam had sort of run out of this because, beautiful though the maps may be, they weren't very useful, whereas the aviation maps were useful and essential, as my experience nearly showed. So then there was this rather melancholy meeting in Bangkok of the United Nations, who were looking after the project, Cartographic Office, who said, we're going to pull the plug. 852 sheets had been made. They were 40 shy of completing the totality of the world, but they decided to end it. And so I wrote a piece about it, and it was years ago. I was fascinated. I've seen individual sheets, and they are things of great beauty. And but I could never find a complete set. I knew that a set had been commissioned by the American Geographical Society. That's not the National Geographic with its yellow magazine. This is the AGS, which is a much more sort of academic organization based in Manhattan, but they've fallen on rather hard times because geography is not a popular subject in America anymore, and moved to Brooklyn and then moved to one floor in Brooklyn, and they gave away their 850 sheets, but the person that gave them away couldn't remember, well, I'd retired. So I spent years looking. Every time I turned up in a city which had a good university with a geography department, I would go, have you got the IMW sheets? They'd say, no, we've been wondering where they are. They must be somewhere. And I was in Madison years and years ago, and I went to the geography department. No, they haven't got them. So I was stumped. And then one day, 3 or 4 years ago, I was on a book tour, much like this, I can't remember what book, with the driver who always takes me in the Midwest, chap, very nice fellow called Bill Young. And we had been in Madison, I think. And then we were going to Milwaukee and then turning south to Chicago, where he was based. And in Milwaukee, I was due to talk at Boswell's bookstore, which I've done a couple of times. And on the way down, Bill took a telephone call and he said, sorry to have to say this. This is the evening of the Wounded Ego. I'm afraid a much more popular author than you, who's written a detective story or something, he's going to be at Boswell's tonight. So you've been demoted and you're going to a department in the university. And I thought, oh, well, anyway, you live with these kind of disappointments. So we drove to this rather anonymous red brick building in the university campus. And I'll never forget the moment when I got into the lift up 4 floors and the doors opened to this Aladdin's cave of geographical wonders, hundreds of map cabinets, hundreds of wall maps, globes, turns out the biggest collection of globes on the planet. And this wonderful woman called Marcy Bidney, who said, and incidentally, there was a large crowd of people, so my ego was assuaged, as it were. And Marcy said, hi, are you Simon? I'm Marcy, curator of this. And I said, this is wonderful. Have you? And she said, yes, I have. And I said, do you know what? She said, I know what you want. I know what you've been looking for years. And we have them here. Let me show you. And we went to drawer after drawer after drawer and pulled out some of these 852 beautiful maps of the entirety, almost the entirety of the world.
And so are they still in Madison?
This isn't Madison, this is Milwaukee. But
so
yes,
Milwaukee,
they're still there. And Marcy, she and I did a gig together on this current book tour a few weeks ago. And she promises there's going to be a big exhibition, post-pandemic and so forth.
Oh, that's great.
It is. It's a wonderful story.
And what town is it in?
Milwaukee.
Oh, it's in Milwaukee. Can the public go see these maps?
Yeah, I think so. I think you might these days have to make an appointment. But yes, I think because they're so important in mapping history, the university will arrange, for gallery or something to show some of the nice ones. I mean, we've reproduced one in the book. I think it's northern Venezuela. You can't really see the beauty of the thing, but if you see them in person, you just, at least I.
Well, you're the guy who ruined when you wrote your book, the map that changed the world. It was hanging on a wall in a obscure hallway behind a curtain in London, across from what's not Harrods? What's the other department? Fortnum and Mason.
Yeah, exactly. You stagger out of Fortnum.
And then your book becomes an international bestseller. And I remember after reading your book, walking in there in London, and I said, I'd love. Yeah, we know what you're here to see. It's because of that Winchester's book. Yes. We'll take you upstairs. They pulled the ropes down on the velvet curtain, and here was the map that changed the world. Yeah. The farmer's single-handed, hand-painted version of the geological strata of the UK.
A wonderful memory, Rudy. Yes.
which was incredible news to the Geological Society at the time, who I gather mainly met to have lunch and drink cognac as opposed to study the geology of the place. So that's the IMW, International Map of the World
at the scale of 1 to a million. Yeah, in University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee.
I got it. Okay, I will. It's so noted. Now, you guys and you Brits, I know you're an American now, and you live in Massachusetts, but your accent sort of indicates you lived in England for a while. You have something I'd never heard of till reading your book called the Ordnance Survey, the OS, and apparently it's been around a long time. It's a thing. Brits are very proud of it. You can go in bookstores and buy the Ordnance Survey for a particular region.
Yeah.
What is the Ordnance Survey?
Well, the original maps of England were made by the Ordnance Department of the Army because they needed to know where to put their artillery and so forth. And so,
Ordnance Survey.
ORDNANCE. And so ordnance maps were created in, I think, the 1780s or something. And it took 200 sheets, I think, to cover the whole of the British Isles from, this will allow me to another useless piece of information, the most northerly point of the British Isles, which is mapped on an Ordnance Survey map, is an island in the Shetland Islands with the lovely name of Muckle Flugga.
Of what?
Quite. Muckle Flugga. M-U-C.
Muckle Flugga. Is that all one word?
No, it isn't. It's two. And so M-U-C-K-L-E, Muckle Flugga, F-L-U-G-G-A. And
another bar bet.
I went there once. There's a lighthouse and there's a lighthouse keeper. So if you can imagine big men with oars and things rowing me across to this, and you go up these seaweed covered iron steps up to the lighthouse at the northern tip of Muckle Flugga. And I remember saying pompously to the keeper, so all of the United Kingdom is to the south of me. He says, not quite yet. Look around. And I turned around and there was the sea, which went endlessly to the North Pole, except about half a mile north, there were waves breaking on a tiny little piece of rock called Outstack. And that is the northernmost extent of Her Majesty's dominions. So if anyone in a pub says, bet you don't know the northernmost point of the United Kingdom, and he says Muckle Flugga, you can say it's not, it's Outstack.
Right, so these OSs, though, Brits buy them now for what? For hiking? For what?
Yeah, for hiking. They were always, when I was growing up, at the scale of 1 inch to the mile, which is 1 to 63360, because if you do 1760 by 3 by 12, that's 63360. And these maps were so beautiful. I mean, I have plenty here. I should sort of pull one out and show you. But yes,
they're still on sale. They're still on sale everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. And you go to grocery shops, and if you go to a sort of particularly attractive area of the countryside, the Lake District or Scotland, where I go a lot, or almost all grocery stores will have them of the local area.
Just of the local area, okay.
Well, yes, but I mean big bookstores.
Is there one massive book of all of the OS maps?
Well, let me see if I've got one I could show you. Yes and no, but not at 1 to 63360. There's one quarter inch, which is 1 to 25,000, and they're printed in a beautiful, beautiful, I don't know whether the Ordnance Survey still does it, in a beautiful red leather cover. But the thing about it is that they are woven into the fabric of every English child's grey matter, because you have to know what are called the conventional signs, the little things on the map that indicate where a church is, or a post office, or a telephone box, or they're all marked on the map.
The symbols, yeah.
Symbols. So those symbols, which in England are called...
Are these maps still updated regularly?
They are. They're people are very proud, and there's a huge office in Southampton, I think. No, it is Southampton, because we're also good in Britain of producing nautical charts, and so most of the world's sailing charts are made in Britain as well. We still have something going for us, not very much, but making good maps is part of what we're still quite good at.
Well, before I say goodbye to you, bringing up nautical reminds me of one part of the world that we have not mapped as thoroughly as one might have expected at this point, and that is the other acres that are covered by water. What's the state of mapping there?
Well, you should have on your show one of the people, excuse me, that is responsible for this new. It's called GEBCO, the what is it now? Anyway, it's basically GEBCO. It's a general bathymetric map of the planet, which is mapping the seafloor. And the extraordinary thing is that the seafloor of our planet, because of this inconvenient appearance of water over it, is mapped much less well than the surface of Mars and the surface of the moon. We know the moon to within, I think, a meter or even centimeters, as was shown by the landing the other day of Perseverance, I think it was, on the surface of Mars. Mars is mapped in a very sophisticated manner. We don't know the contours, the arrangements of the seabed to within a kilometer, maybe 5 kilometers. We've really got a hazy awareness of what's down there, and that's changing. GEBCO is this worldwide attempt, financed largely by the Japanese now, to understand and then map what the world would look like if all the sea had disappeared. And of course, the very opposite is happening because...
Well, let's talk about that. It's a perfect way to end. We are losing land. And it's probably faster than I think. Well, when I read your book, I know it's faster than I think. There is going to be, and this is leaving aside natural disasters that might plunge Battery Park in New York, or what's called the Marina District in San Francisco, that's built on, near as I can tell, soft mud, that will just, as you say in your book, liquefy if a couple plates rub each other the wrong way underneath the sea. Leaving aside those kind of calamities, what are we losing? What are we losing just naturally while we're sleeping and not thinking about it?
Well, if I can take you back to the beginning of Gone with the Wind, when Gerard O'Hara, riding his white horse over towards Scarlett, who's looking miserable because another love affair has gone south, and he says, "Oh, what's the matter?" And she says, I'm going to sell Tara." And he gets off his horse, says, "Well, whatever your love life is like, Scar, you must never sell Tara, because land is the only thing worth living for, the only thing worth fighting for, the only thing worth dying for, because land is the only thing that lasts." Well, it's not. That's the funny thing. Since that book Margaret Mitchell wrote in the 1920s, we've come to understand that land doesn't last because the sea is getting warmer, there's more of it, and the ice caps are melting, and whatever some political parties may say, it's an inescapable fact that the sea is clawing away at the land. And in the United States, we haven't lost very much. I mean, the East Coast has maybe lost, 13,000 acres or so in the last decade. That's nothing. But in the Pacific Ocean, whole countries are being threatened. Tuvalu, Kiribati, move further west, Bengal, we were talking about earlier, great chunks of southern Bangladesh are being swallowed up. New Zealand, first country in the world in so many ways, has offered climate change refugee status to people from, let's say, Kiribati, the old Gilbert Islands, who are flooded out to come to New Zealand to begin a new life because they realize that the sea is going to completely inundate whole countries. So land is no longer immutable. It will be in the middle of the United States for decades, centuries to come. But a lot of coastlines are going to change their configurations very substantially over the years, and land is not going to be as extensive tomorrow as it is today.
Those of us who are in wealthier nations, however, are trying to build all kinds of things, whether it's Venice building flood, big pieces of metal sheaths that come out of the sea when the sea rises, or if it's Miami, trying to change the contours of the land or trying to ameliorate floods there, or down at New Orleans. I mean, you know better than I that countries that can afford some of this are are making an effort to save some of this land. Are they spitting into the wind, Simon?
It is rearranging the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic, yes. The famous saying, man proposes, but God disposes. Nature will do to mankind what nature wishes to do. That was true, as Mark Twain wrote of the Mississippi. It's true of what is being said more generally. Yes, it's whistling into the wind. The sea level is rising. The amount of land is disappearing. We have to live with that.
The book is called Land. Maybe, Tommy, can you put up the book jacket again for folks who might have tuned in late to see it? Simon Winchester's newest book is called Land, How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. It just came out in the last month. And it's a fascinating look at a subject. Typical Simon comes out with these enormous subjects. And I think, how can he write? No, this is no slim volume, this book. He wrote a lot about land, about the history, as you heard during our talk here today. And the stories of our misuse and use of land, and the price we paid for bad borders, or the price people have paid to increase their borders, is just astonishing. I can't recommend the book more. Simon Winchester, you're kind to join me for a second time, and I was just thinking, I often joke that I wrote a bit about Peter Max, the artist, who sort of notorious for having many copies of his style of art turned out because he had a basement full or a warehouse somewhere in New York full of unknown artists mimicking his style and selling and making millions. I always think you have a small battalion of writers in your basement there in Massachusetts writing books because you turn them out so elegantly and so effortlessly and so rapidly. I'm very envious of you, but delighted that you're writing the books you're writing, because we're all better for them.
Well, you're so sweet to say so. I must make sure. Be quiet down there.
The workers? What is that huge map behind your head, way on the wall behind you?
I think that is probably a map for which I paid a great deal of money on the undersea telegraph cables running around the world. So
everybody should have a map of the undersea telegraph cables on their wall. Do you need to know where those are for any particular reason, Simon?
Oh, well, who knows what the next book will be? Yes, I feel I need to know. In fact, they are relevant to the next book I'm doing, so there's a reason for them being there.
Do we want to mention what the next book is?
I'm afraid you'll make caustic remarks about it.
No, Simon, I'm your friend.
I know you're my friend. Well, it's a book on the history of knowledge, on how...
Another small subject,
I know,
Simon.
It's a mere nothing. A mere bagatelle.
Some people write a book on a year in Provence.
Sells rather better, Mr.
Well,
yes.
Knowledge. Well, best of luck to you. I know it'll be as entertaining as always because of your eye for detail and anecdote and what shaped the way we live today with things that came before us. So I look forward to it.
Well, you're very kind, Rudy. Lovely to talk to you. Keep warm up there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's supposed to be 60 here on Sunday, by the way.
Not here.
Saturday.
Not here.
That is unheard of. Well, it's unheard of. I mean, that's ridiculous. It'll only last 10 minutes. Simon Winchester, thank you very much. Commend the book Land to folks who are watching now and on YouTube. Thank you for joining us, Simon.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
see you all in about 2 weeks. We'll do it again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.